as we go. So welcome to this session. Welcome to this session on behind the scenes of participatory budgeting. My name is Kimbra White and I'm from MosaicLab. There are a number of MosaicLab team people in the room that you'll probably meet during this session as we move through this. We are going to do three things today. The first is we're going to just jump in and do a PB process. So you're going to get to do participatory budgeting. We have $10,000 of chocolate money to allocate in this session today. Then we've got a panel. We've got a panel from the UK and Australia to talk about participatory budgeting. They're people that do a lot of PB or have been researching PB. So we'll have a panel session, and then after the panel session there'll be lots of time for Q&A. So we're going to jump straight in to doing PB. So in your group, your question is how would your group best spend up to $10,000 to take participatory budgeting forward in, I don't know, your local workplace, your local council, your local school, just wherever money is allocated. Just wherever's a spot where you might find money is allocated.
So we're not spending the money, you're not looking at an idea for how to spend the money?
Yes, we're looking for an idea. Your best idea for spending $10,000. Now, there are a couple of rules. When you've decided on your best idea, you need to also decide how much money you need for it. Do you need $1,000 for it, $2,000, or do you need the whole $10,000? You know, you want the lot. Please make it multiples of multiples of thousands, because I don't want to have to cut up the chocolate bars, okay? So that's about the only rule. I think there's one other rule on your sheet which says you can't allocate it for personal gain. Okay, so it's going to be something a little bit worthy. We will have a template for you to write your idea down in a minute, but let's just jump in, have a conversation about what your best idea is. If this question is meaningless to you, or you're thinking, what on earth are we doing right now? Put your hand up and one of the team will come over and talk to your group. So let's just get into it. Okay, well done everyone. You've all done the project. Just please check before whoever it is that is going to do the pitch from your group. Have you put the amount of money on that you want?
Yep.
Have you got the amount of money, everyone? Okay, so why don't we start at the front, because they'll finish first, so we'll give them the prize for finishing first. You're going to pitch to the rest of the group. Catch box. You need to catch this. Testing. Oh, it does work. So I don't have to yell. Okay, are you timing? Keep timing. Okay, go. Hi, my name's Lucy. Our idea is a dog water park. We have an off-leash park which is very famous. It's where Dogs Bones Cafe is. And 1/3 of the park has been inadvertently sterilised through a public transport project. I would like to create a dog water park up there through a community-led co-design process. I'm pitching for $10,000. With that money, we'll run in-park activities to scope and design what the water park will look like. And then we'll be able to scope it up and then pitch and find money, which I think will come from Transport for New South Wales for stuff up our park in the first place. So that's our pitch. Why is it important? Because the park's been partly sterilised, because it would be community capacity, and because dogs love water. Okay. Just before you do throw it, remember you do need to listen to these, because the next step you'll be voting on the one you like the best. So that is number one, the dog water park. Okay. Put that up at number one over there, and you get to choose whoever you would like to go next. Okay, people who are pitching, put your hand up. She's going to throw. Okay, I'm ready to throw. You ready? You need two hands. To catch. 2 hands to catch. Yeah, you've got to put your paper down, because I'm throwing a microphone at you. Oh, it's a microphone.
Ready?
Okay, we need to.
Off you go.
Okay, so our
project is called the Happiness Project. And who doesn't want to be happy? Absolutely. And what we're doing is we're going to start with our school, and we're going to create an app and an educational campaign so that they can know all about PERMA, which is Martin Seligman's formula for happiness. So why it's important, we want to empower young people to build happiness and resilience. We want to encourage positive identity in a really accessible way, and we want to assist them to reach their full potential. So if anybody here is the parents of teenagers, you'll know how sometimes they can be a little bit down on themselves and not have confidence. Well, we want to change that.
Right. That is number 2, and you get in a moment to I was just going to say, some of you have noticed that our guest speaker from the UK has been on the screen.
Hi, Jess!
He's in this camera over here. Just so you know who he is, you can all wave at him.
Hi, Jess!
I'll introduce you to him later. Okay, so you get to choose who's going next.
I'm not going to be predictable.
Hello everyone. We've decided to go for a school-based community garden, and we want to establish a garden based in the local school so that the kids can get involved with the teachers, etc., and become part of the curriculum. Use local resources as much as possible to build the structures, so the raised beds through men's shed, and we'll look for upcycled tools, so we're not spending as much money. Use the produce, so kind of the education of school, farm to play education within the school and the community. Sustainability built in by selling the excess produce, so we'll be kind of turning a profit to keep the garden going. And we'll also look environmental by using sustainable water collection through rainwater irrigation systems. And we want to establish a beehive in the garden. 3 reasons: education, sustainability, and community, building community through food empowerment. $2,000.
Wow, and that is number 3. And you get to choose who's next.
So we're asking for $10,000, and our project is called Get Moving. We've taken a different approach, and our project is all about giving community ownership to tackle the issues that they face. And we want to create a grant fund that the community votes on, where the community fund projects that increase physical activity to get the community moving. And the 3 reasons are obviously to give community ownership, to increase rates of physical activity, and to increase the rates of participation and increase social connectivity.
Could you do it over there, then he can see it?
Okay, right. Come with me.
Right. All the way
And
over
that-
because it's a very important project.
Yeah, that camera will follow us.
Okay, right.
It's very strange we're looking at him, but he's over here.
That is weird. So our project is called Experiential Learning, but it's about helping kids have some ownership over the decisions that are made around budget expenditure at their schools. So what we want to do is a 2-stage process. We'll have the capacity building of teaching staff and students in the participatory budgeting process that they'll then go through each year, that will be student-led or teaching staff-led, depending on the age of the students. Why you should vote for it, because it's sustainable, it's capacity building, it's experience-based, and it promotes both adult and youth leadership. And we're asking for $4,000.
Alrighty, so now we're pitching our project to an ageing population and community. We're pitching for a community garden, fountain and trail. We're hoping with our community garden we can build a more healthy lifestyle for our ageing population who have downsized and want to connect with their peers and the rest of the community. We're aiming to develop community capacity, social capital, get people back together, and hopefully build sort of intergenerational ties. Positive health benefits, increased use of new project, sharing skills amongst the community, and celebrate local history and culture. These are communities that we're asking for 10,000.
And you are group number? 6. 6. There's only one group waiting.
Bring it home.
Bring it home. So now you're going to forget about all the other ideas you've already heard. Just remember this one. So we've picked something local, something that involves children, and something that involves cuddly animals. It's called Saving the Kimbra Koalas. So there's a concern that the koala population in Kimbra is declining because of a decrease in their habitats. So we want to involve the community in helping us understand what is the current population, look at the current lay of the land, and also understand where the population is decreasing, what is impacting the population decline, and then work together on how we can come up with some solutions and understanding people's different roles in it. So we are going to engage a land manager who will then take out school groups and community groups to start to map the population and then explore the solutions. So we did talk about doing an app, but apparently $10,000 won't build us an app.
It's getting you personal.
We're offering $5,000. It's empowering young people. It's connecting decision makers to the community, and it's giving the community simple actions that they can, get involved in part of the solution.
Okay, thank you. Can I have the screen before? Actually, I just want to go back in. Okay, so we are going to individually vote in a moment on which of these we think is the best at answering this question. What will take participatory budgeting forward? What would be the best project in taking that forward in our community? So think about that while we are going to go to Keith, because Keith is going to tell us about how we're going to vote.
The voting will be open in 3 minutes' time. You have 3 minutes to peruse the wall and make your decision.
Is it going to be electronic vote?
Yes,
It will be electronic
yes.
voting.
You
So
do
a phone
need,
or an iPad.
you do need your
Tomorrow
smartphone
mine.
or an iPad, and we can lend you phones if you need them. So you've got a couple of minutes to check the wall, and I'll answer this question while we do it. Oh, you got your iPad. You've got a phone. Okay.
Go on, okay.
Are we going to
You have 3 minutes to review the idea.
It does need a calculator.
No, I just
So the voting is open for 2 minutes. Good luck. Really have a call vote.
Well done, everyone.
We could be asked for a little cheaper if we've done a little bit more to be able to do. We could probably do ours for 4.
You could do yours for 4?
Yeah.
And so you're going to pass it over. This is one of the lessons I learned from Jez. I've actually met Jez several times over the years, and he told me that what in PB processes people often are quite altruistic, and this does actually happen quite often. So you know how to do We are going to go into a panel process in a moment where we're going to hear from Jez, who does PB in the UK. We're going to hear from Jithma, who does just been responsible for a very large PB process in Victoria. And we're going to hear from Helen, who's been doing some research in this area. Before we go there, I'm just going to invite you just for about 2 minutes, either in your group, do you have 1 or 2 questions you really want to ask these people? You've come along here to find out something about PB, so now's the time to say, what's that question I really came along to ask? Or was there something in what we just did now that's made you think, well that worked well, or I don't know that I'd do that. So just think about what those questions are in your group for about 3 minutes, and then we'll get the panel set up and we'll start the panel process. So over to you.
So they're actually making decisions and not just voting because they're told. Also, lots of so we pick buckets. Like there's a thing up where it gives a snapshot of how it went, but we could have made it laid out like what how we can play right and I think part of the methods and decisions to write
Picture with Jess from the UK. It's incredibly stable.
Well, how do you make sure? Even if we get made on is that
We're going to go to Jess first. So I think part of the question is, what is your
Should we introduce him, please? Yes, please. Yeah, I should get him. What?
That was my, what you were saying. Yeah, and that's what my kind of question was about, right?
Showing the other two panel members.
But it's actually not. We can talk together.
It's about right, it's not exactly right, but it's about the same size as the people on the panel. It's good enough.
because it's about synthesizing they might say, my plans, but people...
And I guess if they really wanted to
Thank you. We might move on to this panel process. Just to give you forewarning, Jez, we're going to go to you first, okay? But I just, after I've introduced you, just so you know you're up. So, Jez Hall, so our lovely bloke on the screen. I actually don't know, are you in Manchester or Edinburgh at the moment?
I'm in Manchester, I hope you can hear me. It's still dark here, it's 6 o'clock in the morning, or something like that, 7 o'clock, so Manchester.
Right, yeah, we can hear you loud and clear. There is a bit of a slight delay in the system from us to him. You'll find out in a moment. Jez lives in Manchester, but he's been doing a lot of work in Scotland. So if I read his profile, I'd be saying that. So he's a great advocate and organiser of PB in the UK. He developed some of the very first models about PB that they did in England, and heavily involved with their network there, and coordinates the social enterprise consultancy PB Partners. He has a special interest in promoting and working with PB with young people. Internationally, he sits on the advisory board for the Participatory Budgeting Project based in New York, so he touches in both of these two big ones that we know about, and has supported the very interesting initiatives that are happening in Scotland at the moment. Scotland is allocating very large amounts of money at the moment through PB. And he is also a consultant to the World Bank, to the Kenya Accountable Devolution Program, no idea what that means really, of which PB is a key strand. So we might go to you, Jess, just for 10 minutes at the most. I will let you know when you've got a minute to go. Okay?
Okay, thanks very much. I can't currently see the room. I don't know if the monitor's been switched around, so I'm going to talk to a blank screen and hope that's okay. So basically, yeah, I'm a community activist. I started my journey on PB in 2000 when I was led my community association in Manchester, and I was invited to go to Porto Alegre, the home of PB, to see it operating there. And I just felt it was so totally different from the rather sterile public meetings where I was expected to represent my community and people didn't vote, and the conversation was basically written and controlled by the elected members and the public officials who were controlling our area. So I was really turned on by the energy and passion that I saw exhibited in Porto Alegre, which was the home of PB from the 1980s onwards. And so since then, I've been trying to bring it to the UK. We have a very specific model that we've evolved in the UK, which you just had an example of, which I would perhaps better call participatory grant making, but we see it as participatory budgeting. So that is where local people put forward projects for initiatives that they will run or that they want to see happen in their community, and they pitch their ideas in front of an audience, generally face-to-face, of all of the other people who want the funding, and then everybody votes within that space. And that's really different to the normal grant funding processes where you send in a very long written application to the town hall or to the city authority or wherever, and then a load of people basically score your written application to say, do you write like us? Do we understand you? Are you a bit like us? And if so, then you get the funding, and if you're a bit different or you perhaps have some barriers to your ability to write in their style, then you don't really get seen, and you don't see the other people who are also trying to do stuff in your community. And I think what you saw from your own little experiment here was the opportunity when you're in the room with other people for people to start to emotionally connect with your project ideas and to be altruistic. So we saw people actually offering up some of their money to other groups. And I think what you also saw is if you want all the money, you don't get funded so easily because people think, well, you know, other people, you know, they're a bit greedy. So it changes the dynamic from, or PB grant making changes the dynamic from a few people at the top saying, yes, we validate the sort of people you are, to an open conversation about what positive things people want to do in their community. So there's been 3 waves of participatory budgeting in the UK. The first one was about between 2008 and 2012, where the new Labour government put forward the English national strategy for PB, and they funded Church Action on Poverty, of which I was working at that time, to kind of promote the concept of PB. And there was lots of stuff that was going on, but then most of the PB grant making projects, and it was about grant making, not about mainstream, were kind of died when austerity hit, and the spare cash that councils felt they had, this is generally a council-led process, disappeared. And suddenly the conversation became more about which of our mates we're going to throw off this burning raft, and the conversation took inward. And PB basically died with the transition to the coalition government and austerity and all those sorts of things. So that was the first wave. Out of that, we built lots of learning, but we nearly lost the model as such. But PB Partners, people came together and we started selling it as an idea under a new sort of banner of PB Partners. We were really successful in getting a politician from the USA over to Scotland and sitting in front of a politician in Scotland and basically talking about how that politician, guy called Jeremi Moule, who was an alderman from Chicago, had $1 million that he could spend at his will on improvements to his local community. But rather than him deciding, he decided to run a participatory budgeting process where his residents actually came forward with the ideas. And that was about showing visible leadership in the community So he was basically saying, I trust my community. And he felt that that led him to be re-elected a number of times because of his visible trust that he had handed over. And that appealed to the politicians in Scotland, and so we now have this second wave, which is called Community Choices in Scotland, and the Scottish Government have seed funded maybe 5 to 7 million UK pounds. I can't quite do the maths, but that's about $10 million US dollars into encouraging PB initiatives. And we've seen a real explosion. I'm going to try and share a screen, I don't know if it will work, of all the different initiatives that have happened around Scotland. And some of those you can't see because they're 47 in the Glasgow area, 27 in the Edinburgh area. So there's been loads of new activity over the last few years. We're now in that second wave getting into what's called mainstreaming. So it's not about citizens deciding on where grants should go, but it's about citizens actually directing public services. So for example, recently in the city of Dundee, which is on the east coast of Scotland, they had a strong community planning process over a number of years. They had lots of ideas that had been submitted by local residents through that community planning process, and they basically turned them into projects in each of the 7 neighbourhoods of Dundee City. They put them on a web platform and said, which ones of these projects which we've costed up for park improvements or footpaths or community safety kind of capital works would you like to see funded? And they got 11,000 people voting within a 2 or 3 week period on their online platform that they had developed to kind of run their PB. And what was interesting was that 75% of those people had never previously engaged in the community planning process. So the challenge now in Scotland is how we can move to this mainstream. How can all public money be directed through a more direct participatory process than the traditional community forums where a few kind of confident people come along and sit down in a room and have a debate with officers. So they've now got an agreement with every local authority in Scotland that 1% of public money, generally at the moment it's public money that comes from central government, but most does, will be spent through a participatory budgeting process. And that means somewhere between 10 and 20 million UK pounds in a city like Glasgow, 100 million across the whole of Scotland per year will be spent through residents directly voting in some mechanism for projects that they want to see happen in their communities. We've also seen PB evolve in many, many different ways. So, for example, youth-led PB. In one area of Scotland, we've seen a process where young people were encouraged to come up with ideas both through an online platform and then fund £70,000 or £80,000 worth of projects for young people. We got 5,000 young people voting, again through an online platform, mainly in schools. 5,000 is something like 75% of all of the young people within that local area. We've had other pilots around tackling Islamophobia led by Police Scotland. We've had pilots around mental health. We've had projects where money from community renewable energy profits, so wind farms and solar panels, the surplus profit from that has been put into and matched with council funds. We've seen projects where the National Lottery, which is a big foundation which grants to community groups, have aligned their funding processes with local authority funding processes. So this model of participatory grant making, I think, is really good for stimulating people to get involved. They really like it. They see the immediacy of coming along into a room, hearing different ideas and voting for them. But the challenge will be, how do you take that passion and energy to a major online, because it has to be online when you're getting hundreds of, thousands of people voting. What do you lose in that process of moving to the large scale? And we're kind of wrestling with that conversation. One of the definitions of PB I really like, which I picked up in Brazil many years ago, is if it feels like we've decided it's PB. If it feels like someone else has decided it isn't. So it's very much about your sense of, when I take part in this process, do I feel that I have made a difference? has my voice, has my vote counted? And that is a really...
I'm trying to interrupt onto Jez. I just didn't know if my microphone was on. Sorry, Jez. 1 minute. You've got 1 minute to finish.
Okay, so that idea, that emotional response that I have done something good today, I've come along to this public meeting, and we sometimes get 800 people turn up in a village hall in a small community looking at the different projects and participating. If I feel that I've done something good in this moment, then I'll do it again. Because particularly the most disadvantaged people, the people who feel that the system isn't working for them, have got some real challenges in terms of time in order to get involved. It's costly. I have to find childcare, I have to find somebody to help me get in if I'm disabled, I might have language barriers. So if you're going to get those sorts of people involved, they have to get an immediate feedback. They have to see the opportunity that's come to them. So I really like the grant making model, but I'm aware that actually if we're going to get to the big dollars, then we need to move towards the mainstream, and that I think is the challenge.
Okay, well.
So there you go.
Thank you. That's fantastic. So we're going to move on to Helen Christensen. Helen's an engagement specialist and researcher with over a decade's experience in designing and delivering engagement in the public sector. She's an IAP2 Australasia trainer, so you may have met some of you through training, and an IAP2 Australasian board member. In her spare time, she is doing a PhD at the University of Technology in Sydney, looking at the practice and professionalism of community engagement in Australia's local government. Some of us filled in a survey about that, so some of you might have been part of Helen's research. One of her research papers has been about PB, so we're going to find out what she's learned or what questions she has about PB. Do you understand? Are you happy sitting?
Can you see me?
Yep. Good. Except I have to give you a 10-minute clock here, so you'll be able to see how you're going.
Fabulous, thank you. So this is a bit weird. Normally when I'm at an IAP2 conference, I put my facilitator or practitioner hat on, I put my researcher hat on, so I'm a bit scared I'm going to be a bit more boring than I normally am, so I apologise in advance.
Me too.
That's it, the fun's over. No, seriously. So apologies for being rude, I've made some notes on my phone because I have many skills, but my memory is not one of them. So I'm here because I did some research a couple of years ago. It's been published in the Australian Journal of Public Administration. Hands up if you're a subscriber. Okay, there's a couple. Usually the IPA members get it as well, so they might have seen it in that. So what we did is we had a look at the early participatory budgeting processes in Australian local government. So we're a bit late, Australia, a bit more happening kind of in Scotland by the sounds of it, a bit earlier. We're a bit late to the table. So the first processes kind of happened in 2012, and then there was a bit of a flux of them quite quickly. Now, my background is local government. Hands up local government people in the room. That's why they're so good looking. So I have a local government background, and I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but people look at processes and they get a bit fatty and they go, oh, that one, and they just pick what they want and how do we do that, and we want the same sort of thing. So the research was motivated from the position of, hang on, let's just have, what is it? What's it supposed to do? What's it supposed to look like? In what ways is it appropriate to adopt it and to adapt it? Because these things, sometimes they get a bit bastardised and a bit watered down, and then you start to see the bad practice creeping. What we did, the fancy research terminology, was the textual analysis. What that means is stuff we could find on the internet. So everything that we could find on the internet, and there's a whole nother conversation I'd love to have with people, particularly if you're in government. If it's not on your website, researchers don't think it happens, right? And if you delete it from a website, it's the equivalent of burning books, right? It literally never happened. So it's stuff that we could find on the internet. We looked at the history and the definitions. And interestingly, and Jez spoke a little bit about this, in the late 1990s, participatory budgeting for people around the world that were doing it, it was open to all. It was a direct democratic rule, so everyone gets a vote. It was integrated with the representative bodies, so it had to kind of fall into line with the politicians. And the resource and budget allocation was determined through criteria that ensured social justice. That was if it ticked those boxes, it was participatory budgeting. Now, over time, those things have changed. So the open to all has been reinterpreted as representative samples, and that speaks to the trend in many publics. Direct democracy rules have often made way for consensus building models and so forth, although that's not always the case. And what we did is when we compared what we think were the first 6, because it's all we could find on the internet, of these processes. So there was 2 in Geraldton in Western Australia, the Melbourne Long-Term Financial Plan, Darebin's part of their capital works budgets, Canada Bay, which was the first one, and Melville's Participatory Grants program. Sorry, I need my notes because my memory's not very good at all. We looked at a lot of things. We looked at the time frames. Was this a participatory budgeting process which was launching over a year, over a 10-year, over a 2-year period and so forth, and I'll give you the results a little bit later on. We looked at the budget areas, and there was quite a bit of diversity. Was this the operational budget and services budget and capital works budget? Was it everything for that period of time? Or was it 2% of the capital works budget? Or was it just the grants program or whatever? We looked at the ratio of the overall budget to what was available for participatory budgeting. So, you know, you're selling it as a $2 billion project, but it's really like only 0.015% of your whole budget and so forth. We looked at the use of deliberative methods, the use of representative samples, and the outputs in terms of the number of recommendations that were made and then accepted. And we also looked at the use of third parties, so consultants or independent bodies that were brought in to do oversight or recruitment or facilitation and so forth. So what did we find? There's a lot of diversity. Yeah, everyone is adopting and adapting at different rates. They all look very, very different. And I realise that quite a few more processes have happened since this research has happened as well, so it's probably, I'm guessing, even more diverse. So Kimbra asked me to do 3 things, but I can't follow instructions very well. And on research, I can't tie it up in a bow for you so that you walk out of the room and go, oh, we went to this talk and the research and the data and the evidence says we must do this. No, it just doesn't work. Instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to pose half a dozen questions, which is what we did in the research. And the thought of posing the questions is, I am an advocate for participatory budgeting. I think it's great, but like all engagement methods, I think it's great when done well. So the questions are more designed to provoke the thinking around what would make it be done well. So the first question was to consider the role of deliberative practices in participatory budgeting. So the original processes in Porto Alegre and Brazil and so forth, they weren't deliberative. Deliberative does bring some phenomenal benefits. It allows time and space for questions, for bringing issues, for setting criteria, discussions and so forth. But it has a couple of disadvantages. It's quite resource intensive and it's not representative. It's not inclusive of everybody who wants to participate. The second question is, what's the longevity of this stuff? So some of them have done, processes for a year or 10-year outlooks and so forth. The early Brazilian ones were an annual rotating program of kind of allocation and oversight of funds, whereas like a lot of Australian councils have done one huge, big, really, really expensive process and then needed a couple of years to recover from it, let alone what's happening with next year's budget. The third question is, how should organisations and leaders adapt for participatory budgeting? These are usually intensive processes, whether they're deliberative or not. There's access to materials, information, ways that it can be presented in a certain format, and there's quite a bit of a commitment required for organisations to enter into that. What is the impact of PB upon the roles and responsibilities of local and state governments? And this is me getting a little bit political sciencey here. So while the remit of the PBs has been to allocate resources, in all of the ones that we looked at, they made additional recommendations outside the scope of their remit. Right? Can't help themselves, can they? Now, I think it's a fabulous thing. It included things like, we think that there should be more schools, we think there should be more road infrastructure, that we think developer contributions should change, we think that you should provide these community services, and local governments, it's not in their purviews, they're not licensed, they're not kind of have the powers to do it or the legislation backing to do it or the funding. So while that's all well and good, part of it is that if that keeps happening, could it fracture the relationship between local governments and state governments if they don't stay in their own sandpit, given that state governments kind of legislate for what local governments can do. And this is me being a bit of a conspiracy theorist as well, that what happens with some processes is the groups make unpopular decisions, but they're more likely to be accepted by the community than if the unpopular decisions have been made by the politicians. So if politicians start farming out difficult decisions to communities and letting them have the blame, I think one of the academics calls it, sharing the outcomes and blah, blah, blah. It's not, it's total blame shifting. It's like, oh, well, it's an unpopular decision, but they made it, so, and they're your peers. But it's a risky tactic if they decide to do that, because in some instances they're probably better off just biting the bullet. And in terms of what are the roles of various actors and who should decide them, and part of this speaks to the use of consultants, and I say independent third parties. It gets used all the time, but if the council's paying for them, they're probably not as independent as you think they are. And I think it's me, I'm actually throwing stones at myself. It's painful. Sorry to witness myself harm, but it is an ethical consideration. I'm just putting it out there. But it's also interesting as well because it suggests that communities trust these third-party bodies more than they trust their governments, which raises a whole lot of issues of who's got guardianship over democracy. And the last question was, are Australian participatory practices democratic? And the short answer is that it is all in the intent and the execution. So I've got 49 seconds left, and I'll just say, if you want a copy of the article, let me know and I'll email it through because it's behind paywall. Fantastic.
Move along here in a minute. So thanks, Helen. We're going to our third speaker, who is Jithma Bena. I practice it so many times. I'm sorry. Beni Agama. Jithma is a digital media expert who's worked in both China and Australia. In China, he developed some of Australia's first mobile In China, he developed some of Asia's first mobile content services and digital media infrastructure. In Australia, he was one of the first members of Telstra's mobile media division. In 2014, he made the move to the good side, to the government, to become the Director of Digital Engagement for Victorian Department of Premier and Cabinet. His overall role is to improve the government's digital experience, to make it easier for people to interact with the government via digital channels. As part of this role, he's been responsible for the big PB initiative we've just had in Victoria, the 30 million Pick My Project Participatory Budgeting Initiative, where I think you have just told the people who won.
Yes, we have.
Yeah, so over to you. Thank you. Thank you, Helen.
And sorry, I've got notes as well, so apologies. There's some stats that are quite interesting. So maybe I'll start a little bit with a bit of context as to why we did Pick My Project. And really, there's a lot of drivers around it. So there's a growing demand, a growing want from the community to be more involved in decision making. People are really starting to reach out reach out and want to be part of the process, want to understand why decisions are made, how they're made, and how they can be part of that process. Within government, there's a whole bunch of other drivers that are really interesting and ones that people like me and my team can grasp, which are, there's a real thirst to try new things. There is this view that digital as a platform can allow government to make decisions faster, to engage more deeply, more quickly, and more cheaply. And so with those types of streams sort of happening all at the same time, it really gave us a good platform to sort of pitch a few new ideas. It also helped that SA had done a very similar program the year before. And so we pitched the idea of Pick My Project. We actually pitched something a little bit bigger. Thank God they didn't agree with that when we went with something a little more constrained for our first attempt of it. But it was $30 million of grant funding to be decided by the community. And straight away we had a bunch of people going, it's not going to work. And we had a whole range of different reasons that were brought up as to why it was going to work. So one was that all the money would end up in the city. And so we said, right, fine, we'll say it's a 50-50 split. We'll say there's 15 million for the city and we'll do 15 million for regional Victoria. And then there was the next hurdle that was put up in front of us, which was, it's only gonna, sorry, a bit of context. The way that we structured the program was mapped back to a concept called regional partnerships and metro partnerships in Victoria. So I think there's 14 of them, thereabouts. And so the money was then going to be split up between those different groups. And so the next thing that we were looking at was how do we make sure there's equity in how the money is divvied up. And we said, okay, let's sort of try and base it around population of those different areas, but we'll also set a floor of no region will get less than $1 million. And so really what we were trying to do was to, when you look at a state as big, we're in Queensland, a state as quite diverse as Victoria, where you've got big population centres, small population centres, and you're really trying to work out a way that allows for equity, but also when you talk about participatory budgeting, you talk about a process like this, you're trying to get to one that's as pure as possible as well. So it was this real point where we're balancing against how can we put rules in place that deliver equity, but at the same time aren't creating a system or a process that's going to be so convoluted that at the end of the day, I'm not sure, I think it was Jez or Kim said this, but with a process like this, it's about transparency. And the more rules and more things you put in place, actually, sorry, it was you. The more rules that you put in place just makes it really hard to show transparency. And so we had this program, and as we were going forward with it and trying to set it up, it ended up being just a bunch of different decision points that we had to look at as to how can we construct a participatory budgeting process that was going to allocate $30 million out into the state, broken up by regional partnerships, that would deliver some level of equity between the different regions and between large communities and small communities, and sort of it all kept on going and going and going. And to be honest, the beauty of the program was that, yeah, we put a whole bunch of rules in place, but as we saw with the chocolate bar exercise, to some degree, the rules weren't as required as you would think. The community was really they were quite well, firstly empowered, but the process they went through to allocate the funding and to put forward ideas was quite beautiful to watch. So we ended up with something like, I think around about just under 3,000 ideas submitted for the idea phase of Pick My Project. And what that was a really simple online process where you put forward your idea, you put forward what you thought was the budget to deliver it, you put forward whether you thought you needed a partner involved for that idea to be delivered, and you had to have had a conversation with your partner and lots of local councils in Victoria. I think, got a lot of phone calls. And that was about it. And then we went through a process of talking to councils and making sure that those conversations would happen and whether the durability was there and everything else. And so that process where we thought it was going to be, I guess, more complicated than it was actually quite straightforward. But the volumes were the things that really, really scared us. So we thought we dimensioned our team well. We had, I think, 15 people on our assessment team, and the day after, as we were leading up to the close of the ideation phase, we were calling around departments, calling around government, saying we need more people to do assessments. And so that, if we're talking about learnings of a process like this, it's those sorts of things. There are these choke points that you hit along the implementation that you really that really takes some pretty fancy footwork to get through. And so we got through the assessment phase. Again, there was this huge fear that we were going to have a large number of the ideas being rejected, because what we had always told council and partners within the broader VicGov was that if you don't think it can be done, then that's a trigger to not let this thing go to vote. So out of the ideas that were submitted, there was only around about 300 or so that didn't get up. So as a percentage, it's quite small, right? When you think about that diversity of ideas that came forward, and there were some really, really, really interesting things. And so the next step then was the voting phase, and that's sort of in a roundabout way the easy bit, because it's then the community going off and making the decision. But there's a couple of pieces that I sort of missed along the way in the story, that we initially said we thought that this whole program could be run digitally. Digital engagement, that's what we do, and we were really looking at the platform going, right, look at digital, it expands your reach. You can hit so many more people with a digital medium than you can with trying to get people out into communities and doing the face-to-face. And we were wrong. Yeah, we were wrong. We'll find a way to do it better next time. And so we ended up calling it more of an augmented process. It was still digital at its core. It was all about using the power of the medium to get out, to get the community more involved, to be engaged and everything else. But we ran a bunch of, I think there was about 200 community engagement sessions, either done digitally via webinars or face-to-face sessions. We ended up having a contact centre, a broader contact centre in place that was initially there for support, but ended up also being there to take votes. And so I'm watching the clock run down. But I guess if you talk about the big learnings for us, the big one, one of the big ones is the fact that it has to be a balance. It can't be purely one medium or the other. I would say that if we try to do the whole thing through a physical process, we probably wouldn't have got the reach or the number of projects or the diversity of projects that we got. But then using contact centre, using face-to-face more as a medium, we saw a greater diversity of age. The oldest person who voted for a project in Pick My Project was 105 years old. And I'm pretty sure he didn't do it on his mobile phone. But like, that was such a great result, and it's the types of outcomes that we were trying to get. I think I'll stop there.
That's very impressive timing, thank you. We are going to go into a Q&A, but I just wanted to say a couple of things first, which is we put this, MosaicLab put this session together because we really wanted to learn more about PB. We had had the opportunity to manage the IAP2 PB process, where it was MosaicLab that did that. Largely Jane, who is sitting here in the middle, so if you're wanting to know about the mechanics of that, Jane can answer afterwards. And that process was also done with Harvest. Adam, who's here from Harvest, they actually provided the platform in partnership with IAP2 for this process. And we're very interested, because we specialise in deliberation, we're interested in how you put deliberation and PB together. We have, as part of the process that we did for IAP2, we did do a one-page information sheet about what PB is and a one-pager about where it's happening around the world. If you want to grab onto that, it's on our website. If you go to our blog or our events page on our website, it's there for you as a free download. The information, this is the announcements right now, the information that was in your group about what we were doing today has the profile of the speakers and the websites that are associated with the speakers that we've had today. But let's get into questions. I think and this is exactly what we need. So when you ask your question, so that we don't have a reply from every panel member and we never get through this, please say who your question is to, and we'll get that panel member to answer it, and then move on to another question. And we've got one way at the back. Just watch your heads.
Thank you very much. Slips practice as a young person. My question, Jez. Actually, Jez or Tista, but Jez. One of the bits of pushback I get from people around their concerns about PB is people that are very good and practiced at rallying support, end up gaming the system, whereas the more marginalised communities aren't that adept or mature at advocacy, essentially. How have you found, is that an issue, or is that just a furphy of a concern that you end up marginalising people who actually aren't as activated in the community?
Jess, well, we'll just go to Jess first. You asked for Jess?
Jess initially.
Yeah, Jess first.
So I'll have 3 key points on that. The first one is that where PB goes wrong is where somebody tries to manipulate it in order to avoid a problem that hasn't been existing already, and this is a very common concern. And part of PB is getting people to actually wrestle with issues around democracy and participation and representation, and so it's sometimes seen as a sandbox, a safe space where we can have some of these conversations. To your key point, we've got a set of kind of rules or principles that we've developed in our practice. One is that you have to vote multiple times. You can't just vote for one project. So if one group brings along all its supporters, that's fine, because there may be a woman in that group who might be supporting a local football team, but actually then hears a project from a domestic violence project somewhere else and says, I can use some of my votes to support those ones. And then the final point I'd make is that people are very sensible, and if they realise that an organisation or a group has capacity to draw in the funds from somewhere else, they tend to fund the people who don't have those opportunities. So they make a rational choice that that group can go and get the money from somewhere else. So what we see is that PB drives resources to the more marginalised more than your traditional grant-making processes would. It's counterintuitive, but people actually say, that group of young transgender people who stood up today that I didn't even realise was in my community, I think they deserve a chance. And also, and my final point is, in the grant making, particularly where there are presentations and people come together in a space, it's much easier to speak with passion and from your heart about your lived experience than it is to fill that into a funding application form and write it down and send it off. So the immediacy of the PB process also allows voices which are normally unheard to be heard in that space, in that community.
Before you throw up. Okay, thank you. We're going to take 1 question per group, but you can choose who the next group is, so throw it to...
Sorry.
Yes, who's your question to? You have to
I
choose.
suppose, I'm interested in whether the outcomes for the money, and if you can't answer this, to defer to Jez, if through this process you get better outcomes. I hear you, Jez, about the passion and how that can be expressed in a group and people can change their vote, and it's probably easier for community to put forward for a grant application rather than filling out 20 pages. But has there been a measurement of the outcomes, in any study anywhere? And maybe Helen might have the answer. So if we start with you, Jim. Thank you.
I'd say for our program it's a little bit early in terms of doing the full outcome analysis of this. We've just finished the allocation. The announcement as to when the funds are going to be allocated. What I can say out of that process is that we saw a huge diversity of projects that were funded. And we saw the projects that did get funded. Well, it comes down to the heart of the process, right? So the projects that got funded were the ones that the communities that they were in, they're the projects that they wanted. So to me, that in some way goes to describing, I guess, whether that was the right outcome or not. The other part of it, and sort of going back to your question earlier as well, is that idea of gaming the system and that sort of thing. The smallest community that got a project funded in Victoria was 75 people. That was a regional community, so it would have been potentially competing against a large regional centre of maybe 100,000 people or thereabouts. And so there's this equity thing that happens through the process. We had another town of 600 people that got 2 projects funded. And so there was so much concern about gaming, and there probably was a little bit of people of gaming trying to happen. I actually saw it on Facebook. I saw people talking about how they could game the system, but we used the same model. We had 3 votes per project, sorry, three votes per person that helped to spread things. And I think those 2 things combined.
Okay, so can you choose the next question? Oh, yep.
You don't have to answer this, it's sort of been talked about. I just want to say it anyway, Gisma, you don't have to answer it, we've got another question, but just to say, to take Joel's point further, the issue for me around PB, I'm a big fan of everything all of you have said, is the popularity contest. So whether you try and jib the system, I don't think it's necessarily that, but to some extent it is a popularity contest, and I love Pick My Project. I think it's a great stepping stone towards equity and people having a say, but I would say it was a popularity contest. The more votes you got it. And so there were a lot of projects that didn't get up, and it can also equally, as Joel said, disenfranchise people. Even if you're not a marginalised group, people can turn off wanting to vote. I had a project in there, and regardless of the outcome, I didn't want to vote. I didn't want to vote because it felt like a popularity contest.
Okay, so let's get a comment on it. So, Jez, is it a popularity contest?
It is a process of people sharing ideas. So yes, there is a voting element in it, and I think that's important. And I think that communities, that is, people who are not part of the system of government, kind of like the immediacy, and it kind of speaks to talent shows and Pop Idol and all those sorts of things. So people understand the process. But what I see also is that you have to have a co-design process. It's really important that the people who are designing this process are also embedded in those communities and have empathy with all of those projects. And therefore, when you're designing the process, you should be thinking about who isn't going to get funded at this. It is competitive. It's not the case that everybody should get funded. And what can we do to ameliorate that disappointment factor? What we often see is that when people understand that they are competing against lots of other projects, they do things like say, actually, I could hand over some of my money to somebody else. So, or they might say, why don't you come along and join our project and we can help you. We've got a minibus, you've got a load of poor teenagers over there, they've got a community centre. We could actually do some stuff together without the funding. So that social capital building it, I think, is really important.
Just to move the conversation,
I think the difference.
Jez, I think it comes back to exactly what you said. I don't think it's about winning and losing who gets what. I think it's about what you said, Jez. It's about, at the end of the day, did a person feel like they had influence? And I think this kind of process can, like Helen said, if it's not done well, can be very mixed about that. Like any engagement, it's a spectrum. There's the ideal at one end, and there's the other at the other end. We're not there yet, but I think Pick My Project, I think, is a really great stepping stone.
Okay. So choose the next person.
Can I make a very quick comment? My first local government job, I was in the community services branch. There were 3 of us that were selected to allocate the community grants program. We had a criteria system. We did it at our computer. We sat down in a meeting room for an hour and we had arguments over our scores. We negotiated, and that's how we made the decision. So I would also pose the question of what is the alternative, if anything better?
Yep. Who are you going to ask them?
This question will most likely be answered by Helen. So, in a local government context, for those that are really quite early in their journey with PB and bringing our elected members up to speed and online with the initiative, do you have any suggestions or strategies of how can we get our elected representatives to have buy-in in supporting PB?
And who are you asking it of?
In context of local government.
So Helen.
Helen, yes.
This is becoming a bit of a complex theme, this one, isn't it? How do we get the decision makers to play along? Yeah, it's, I think, in my own practice, I think it needs to be driven by purpose. I think the question needs to be, what are you trying to do and why are you trying to do it? And then you pick your method and your process and all the rest of it around that. I think we go wrong because we go, I want that one. So I think that's the capacity work that actually needs to be done with decision makers. But I also appreciate it's very difficult and it depends on where you sit in the food chain and your access to that. I think if they do have a bug up their butt about wanting to do it, maybe do it in a way that is controlled. Do an internal one. Do how are we going to spend the staff funds or whatever. But play in a safe environment before you decide to kind of sign up for the Lexus with the payments you can't afford. But I think we should, I know we don't have time, but I don't have the answer. That would be my couple of nuggets. But I reckon there are a lot of people at this conference that can assist you with that as well.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other questions?
How you going? Picking up on the point about the popularity thing, we had a quick discussion about the voice of experts in this, picking up on some in this kind of process, and picking up on some of that deliberative type thing that you mentioned that is starting to bleed into this participatory budgeting process. Just wondering how can you I suppose mitigate that popularity contest using the voice of experts?
And who are you asking?
Or anyone who wants to answer us.
Okay, well, we just lost it.
I've put up a screen share, and I wanted to answer this one. So I don't know if people can see this, but this is our cycle of PB, and it goes from design to informing engaging, setting priorities, developing budget ideas. Our challenge is that PB isn't a one-size-fits-all. It has to be contextualised, and there are different spaces where citizens can participate in the design of this process, in the setting of priorities, in the delivery of some of the projects. And each process will be unique, and you have to kind of have this challenge: how open are we at each of these stages to citizen direct involvement? You can have more deliberation at one point. You can have the decision-making vote as the key thing. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's about how do we build participatory activity at all of the different stages in this process. And I'll share that slide again later on. So to me, it's really important to remember that PB is for a purpose. What are their outcomes? Is it about stimulating new participation? Is it about developing innovative ideas? Is it about building trust in local elected officials? And once you've got that idea of what is the point of doing this, then you can start saying, okay, which elements do we really need to major on? Where do we need to put our energy? Do we need to use new technologies or digital technologies to mobilise people, to put ideas forward or to inform them? Is it about the monitoring and accountability of public funds, so that we want to make sure that our reporting is really effective and citizens can actually say this project actually led to change? So I suppose my general point is PB is not perfect. It's part of a mix of tools, but it should have a purpose.
But Jez, the question was about using experts. So have you ever, in the process, brought in experts to advise the community on, developing their projects or getting information about whatever?
The model would be there would be a widespread ideas generation. Lots of people come up with projects in their communities, and then they choose a certain number of projects that they want to put into the process. And then there's a strainer where those ideas are tested for feasibility, whether they're tested for fairness, is there kind of manipulation or corruption within this process? Are they tested for impact? And it's in that process that experts, whether there are public officials in planning or in delivering projects or experts in youth participation, can play a role in developing those initial ideas into really good projects. So absolutely, PB is not about losing expert voice, but it is about understanding that some people's experience is about lived conditions that they have, and you can't really understand those if you are a white male, well off, whatever. You can't understand the lived experience. So it's about creating new deliberative spaces, new opportunities for people to meet outside of their own community. It's about building those links. So yes, expertise is important, but it mustn't dominate.
Okay, we've probably got time for one last question, if there is one last question.
So I think this one is a bit consistent with one of the other ones that we had, but I'll ask you if that's okay. So what can you pitch to our chairperson or councillors to convince them that the transfer of power particularly is in their interest?
I think I probably have to answer from the position of a practitioner rather than a researcher, because I don't think there's enough in this yet. The way I often start is tell me about one that's gone really bad. And then by unpacking that and doing a bit of a post-mortem, you figure out that, oh, well, people didn't have the information at the right time, oh, we didn't provide that, oh, this didn't happen, and then you can proactively plan to make sure that those things don't go wrong in the future. It's interesting because I think that elected representatives go into the role with an intent of being responsive to their communities, but the context and environment that they work within is often very different. And I think more work needs to be done to understand what that is that makes them separate from how they intended to play the role to how they actually have started to do the role. I don't have the answer. Does anybody in here have the answer? You can probably charge a lot of money. Is it
Yeah, well, why did the Premier of Victoria say yes?
So one of the things that we did as a team was really push the fact that it was a priority. So it was about trying to create a safe space for us to be able to do what we wanted to do. I think, so in terms of community engagement in Victoria right now, I think we have a bit of a chain of existence. So we had a Premier who was, a government who was really responsible for the idea of putting together Engage Vic. So Harvest guys are here. They do a whole of Victorian government, really core department engagement platform. And the drive behind that was that there was an aspiration within Victorian government to do more community engagement, to get the community more involved. You look at the work that we did around the response to family violence, huge parts of that work was done using a human-centred design approach. So the aspiration within our government is there, and so it then gives us the opportunity to pitch ideas, but do it in a way that de-risks it as much as you possibly can. And always have. So our line, it's a pilot, and always focusing on how we mitigate risk through the process, because how we want to do this again as well, right? And so it's how do you create the environment and then land it well, so you have the political capital, not in the EP, but political capital to do it again, or do it differently, or do it bigger. Way to do it.
Okay, so thank you. It is 5 o'clock, and I'd like to say I think it's been fabulous. We've heard from that experience out of the UK. We've had local experience. We've had research experience. It's been a great panel that we've had today. So can you